Making sense of a mess. This lesson is on analyzing and setting up to answer complex prompts and questions. A lot of times when we take a test or have to write a written response to something in school, some of these prompts are very complicated and they have a lot of features to them and can be very confusing. And to some of us, they just look like a mess. Today's lesson is to hopefully help you look at those prompts and papers in a different way to be able to get the information you need, sort it out, and make sense of it so that you can answer and respond to those questions to the best of your ability. So let's start with analyzing a prompt or question. And I'm going to show you a couple of different examples so you can see what this looks like. But first, let me talk about 6 tips to help you when you're looking at a prompt, because prompt pages are complicated things. Okay. The first tip is when you look at a prompt page, everything on the page matters. There is nothing that's insignificant. When you look at a test, a lot of times it'll look something like this, and just one question will have all of this information that you see on it, right? On this page, we have several sentences, things in boxes, things in bullet points, and the deal that you need to remember is that everything on here, every detail is important for you to answer the question. So many times, one of the problems we have is we rush to try to just get started or get it over with because it's not that fun, and we missed important information. So the first step is you need to look at every little detail. It matters. Okay. The second tip is within the information on there, some of the things on there will actually be instructions. Not everything on there is instructions, but some of the things will be instructions. So we can look back at this prompt and we can see not everything on here is instructions. We can look the first sentence. Read the information in the box below. That's an instruction, right? But what's in that box is not instructions. What's down here is not instructions. Another part with instructions is down here at the bottom. So at the top and at the bottom, they've given you instructions. Be sure to clearly state your thesis, organize and develop your ideas, right? These are all instructions and directions. It's important to realize that it's not like maybe a worksheet that you're used to seeing where all the instructions are at top and then you go through it. If you look carefully, they've hidden the instructions throughout the prompt. So you have to look and decide what parts of this prompt are instructions. After you've decided what the instructions are, you have to realize that some of the things on that prompt page are hints. They're not the actual question. They're hints. They're things to help you start thinking in the right direction. A lot of times students confuse the hints on a prompt, on a writing prompt, to the actual writing prompt itself. And if you end up writing about the hints to the prompt, and not the prompt itself, you're not going to get a very good score because the hints are meant to lead you to what the question of the prompt is. So if we look at this one, we have our instruction area up here and down here, but there's also 2 parts of this that are hints and extra info. For instance, on this type of prompt, if you look, right, in this box, you would think that putting this box around it means this is the really important part. But actually, this is just some background information that's meant to help you think about the prompt. You're not actually writing about this specific thing. Okay? This is a hint. It tells you a little background and idea that the prompt is coming from. Again, if you just read what's in this box, like some tests might not have the hint in the box. They might put instructions in the box, or they might put the actual question in the box. That's why you got to look closely at each prompt you look at, because every prompt for every test is designed a little bit differently. It's very confusing to see that in a box would be information that you don't necessarily need to write your response. It's just meant to be a hint and help you. Also, we have another hint and extra info. After the box, it gives you another hint. Although many people work to benefit themselves, some people choose to put others first. Think carefully about this statement. Again, another hint. These 2 are just hints. If you try to write an essay just based off of these 2 things, you will not be writing the correct essay. So next, and this is maybe the most important part to look for, and they usually are not easy to find because of all the instructions, all of the hints that are on this page. You have to look closely and look for the actual question or task that you're being asked to do. So for instance, looking back at this prompt, the actual question The actual task of the prompt is here towards the bottom. So we've read this instruction, there's this information in this box here, there's some more instructions and information there, and then finally it tells you what you're actually being asked to do. In this case, it's write an essay explaining whether people should be more concerned about others than about themselves. That is what you're supposed to write about. How easy would it have been to get thrown off just because this was in a box and think that you're supposed to write something about this? That's very confusing. But if you look closely, it will always tell you exactly what they're asking you to do. This is your task. So the next tip is, once you've decided which part of that prompt is the actual question or thing they're asking you to do, remember you have to sort through all that other stuff. Once you find that, focus in on that part and look for keywords in that actual question. And you may wonder, what are keywords? How do I know what's a keyword? Well, keywords usually include first, in a question or prompt, they almost always include the specific action or type of thinking and writing that the test makers are going to score you on. You should look for words like this. Describe. They want you to describe something. Define. Asking you to define something. Argue. Analyze, explain something, discuss something, and even sometimes to create something. Those words matter. Those are keys because it tells you what kind of thinking they want you to do and what kind of writing they want you to do. Other keywords include the type of writing they're asking you to. The type of writing they're asking you to create could be. It could tell you that you're supposed to write a narrative, which is also another way to say story. A literary analysis might be something you've heard before. That's a different type of writing. An argument or a persuasive paper. Sometimes they might ask you to write a letter. Sometimes they might simply say to write an essay. All of these things involve slightly different types of writing. So you need to know what those are and look for that to see what kind of writing is the prompt asking me to do. If you write a great piece of writing, but it's not the kind of writing they're asking you to write, you're not going to get a good score on that. And the good part about this is usually on tests, the instructions that are on that prompt, the additional instructions, will give you even more idea and even more info on what kind of writing you're supposed to be doing. So for instance, when we go to the keyword on our prompt down here to the actual question and we look for keywords, if we were going to highlight keywords, I might read this and I would look at this way, right? Here's our actual question. Write an essay explaining whether people should be more concerned about others than about themselves. Well, I know that I'm supposed to write what kind of writing? An essay. And in that essay, I'm supposed to be explaining, all right? And what am I explaining? Whether people should be more concerned about others than themselves. I would probably highlight that too because that's an important idea. But that way we know specifically what we're trying to do. Highlighting those keywords will give you the clearest idea to focus on when you start your piece of writing. And that brings us to our last tip, which is once you've done all these things, once you are really sure of the actual question and task they are asking you to answer and complete, then it's time to actually take time to organize your ideas and make a plan before you write. Unfortunately, this is a tip that a lot of people don't take. You're in such a rush to be done with the test or to be done with the writing portion that you don't want to waste any time to plan. Well, I will tell you this, if you want to be successful and get the score you need to pass that exam, you're going to want to make a plan. Even if it's a time test or time exam, take some time to make a plan. Have an idea of where you're going with your writing, of what you want to say before you start writing it. This is the key between students who are very highly successful on these exams and students who fail. You might even notice that there's blank space on the actual prompt page. That is a great space to use in planning your essay. A lot of times the test makers do that on purpose, so they give you a little room to make a plan. So I'm going to have you look at a couple of prompts and pause the screen. And as you look at these prompts, I want you to remember these tips. Try to take all these in consideration as you do it. Tip number one, everything on the page matters. Tip number 2, look for instructions. Tip number 3, look for hints or extra information. Tip number 4, look for the actual question or task you're being asked to do. Tip number 5, look for key words in the actual question. And then tip number 6, organize your ideas and make a plan before you write. Okay, so you try this. Let's look at this prompt page here and see if you can determine which information are the instructions, which part of this is just extra info or hints, and then which part of this is the actual essay, the actual task that they're asking you to do. So take a second, pause the screen, and see if you can sort those parts out. Okay, you should have noticed a few things. First of all, the instructions. The instructions were read the information in the box below, and also this part down at the bottom that tells you other additional instructions that you have. The hints and extra information included the information in this box. And really, this whole section right here was also extra information. If you made the mistake of looking at this and thinking these were the actual instructions, you didn't read carefully enough. Because the actual question or essay prompt was down here. Write an essay about something you have learned recently and how it affected you. The two areas in pink were just meant to give you an idea for what you could write about in response to this actual question. Now, if we were to look at actual keywords in this prompt, we might notice that first of all, the type of writing they're asking us to write, an essay, and they also want you to write about something you've learned recently, and then this is the key part. How has it affected you? So this how question is an important key word. If all you wrote about was something you learned recently and you didn't take that next step of describing and explaining how it affected you, you would miss the point on this prompt. So let's try this again. This is another different test prompt. This actually comes from an AP test. But I want to give you the idea of how all prompts are a little different, but they all have these same features. So let's look at this prompt and let's see if we can figure out the different parts of this one as well. Remember, everything on the page matters. Everything on the page is important. Make sure to pay close attention and try to pick out the instructions, the hints and extra information, and then the actual prompt or question along with any keywords. Go ahead and pause the video and try to do that. Okay, let's look at this a little more closely. Obviously, the first thing that we noticed, hopefully, was that we had instructions up here. Suggested time, 40 minutes. This question counts for 1/3 of the total essay section score. Those are instructions or directions. Again, specific instructions appear at the bottom as well. Make sure your argument's central. Use the sources to illustrate your support. All of this down here, these are further instructions and information you need to complete the prompt as they're asking you to complete it. Hopefully you also identified the extra information. Let's take a look and see what part of this were just hints and extra information. Well, this is extra information. It tells you some definition as to some words you need to know and just some information to help you think in the right direction. Here's another hint with this sentence. And actually the following more instructions. Right? Carefully read the following 7 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Then more instructions, synthesize information from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-developed essay. And then this is the important part. Notice this prompt's a little more complicated. Buried in this short paragraph is the actual task they're asking you to do, and it starts here. You're supposed to write an essay that identifies the key issues associated with the locavore movement and examines their implications for the community. Key words would include identifying key issues, okay, and examining their implications. In your response, you would need to make sure that you both talk about what the key issues are and then discuss how those issues are going to affect the community. If you don't do both of those things, you will not get a good score in the essay. Notice particularly on this one how difficult it was to find the actual question because they surrounded it with so many instructions and extra information. If you're in a rush and not looking at details, you will not be able to be successful. You have to look at the details. Okay, we've talked about the mess. Now let's talk about some soap. Well, soap is actually just a strategy because sometimes some of these tests have prompts or questions that are actually asking you to base your answer on a piece of writing. And usually that piece of writing appears in the test itself. There's something you have to read and then write about, right? And it helps to determine the basic information about the text before you try and answer the question. The SOAP strategy will help you to do that. So what is soap, you ask? Well, if you don't know that, you probably don't smell very good. No, actually the soap we're talking about is a little different. SOAAP. It's a way to remember how you should think about these written texts before you start reading or writing about them. And if you can make sure that you remember soap for each text and figure out what the soap is for each text, it will help you understand what you're reading and be able to write about it with more intelligence and purpose. So SOAP stands for subject, occasion, author, audience, and purpose. And so every time you look at a prompt, you should think about what is the subject of this prompt, what's the occasion, what's the author, what's the audience, and what's the purpose. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In a prompt like this that's asking you to analyze the text below, a lot of times on the page, before you even get into the text itself, there's information on the page. Remember, go back to our last discussion, right? Everything on the page on these prompts matters. And many times in these introductions, it will tell you all of the information you need to figure out SOAP. So if we look at this one, we can quickly analyze it and see for SOAP. In fact, this portion right here gives us all the information we need to figure out SOAP. From that, we can figure out, first of all, what's the subject? What is the topic of the text all about? What's the occasion? Why? When was it written? What is the context? Who the author is, who wrote the text or gave the speech, who the audience is, who was meant to see or hear the text originally. Don't confuse yourself as the audience, right? Just because you're reading it doesn't mean you were the original intended audience. In fact, for most of these texts, in fact, for all of these texts, when they appear in a test, the person who was writing it or saying it originally did not think it was going to be in a test. So you have to remember who was the original audience. How would they have heard things differently than how you heard things? And then finally, what's the purpose? What action or result did the writer or speaker want to happen after the audience read the text? So let's see what this looks like. In the prompt we were just looking at, we could break down this introductory information and see all of the parts of SOAP, right? So we can look in here. Benjamin Banneker, the son of former slaves, was a farmer, astronomer, mathematician, surveyor, and author. In 1791, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, framer of the Declaration of Independence and Secretary of State to President George Washington. Read the following excerpt from the letter and write an essay that analyzes how Banneker uses rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. If we break that down, first of all, right off the bat, we see who the author is, underlined in red. The author is Benjamin Banneker, right? Then later on, in blue, we see who the audience is. Who was he writing to? This was a letter to Thomas Jefferson. The occasion? The occasion was he wanted to, what? Write him a letter. The purpose, which here is clearly to argue against, and finally the subject, slavery. All of the information we need right here. What you'll find is that When you know all that information before you start reading or before you start trying to respond to the prompt, you will be able to understand the reading better. You will be able to write more knowledgeably. It will help you all the way through. So don't forget to use SOAP. Really quickly, why don't you try practicing SOAP on this prompt? Go ahead, read the introductory information, see if you can determine all the parts of SOAP: subject, occasion, audience, author, and purpose. Take a minute to pause the video and try to do that now. Let's start with the author. Clearly, the author in this passage is Florence Kelly. The actual audience of this passage originally was the convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Philadelphia. The subject is child labor. The occasion was a speech in Philadelphia on July 22nd, 1905. And finally, this was a little tougher to find. The purpose was that she fought successfully for child labor laws and improved conditions for working women. That's the purpose of her speech. With all of that information present, it makes it much easier to understand the text that follows. It's important to look closely at these kinds of prompts too, and to try to determine before you read and answer questions what the SOAP is for each reading. I hope this lesson was helpful for you. If you have any additional questions, make sure to talk to your English teacher to clear up anything that you don't understand.